Now, a couple of things. The reason I wanted you to have this. A lot of people, if you look at the Declaration, an awful lot of the verbiage of the Declaration is comprised of the charges against George III. Halfway down on page 1, he has refused to assent to laws, he has forbidden his governors, he has refused to pass other laws, and then you go on and on and on as to all the charges that are leveled against the king. But the philosophical part of the Declaration is in the first couple of paragraphs on page 1. When in the course of human events, and we hold these truths to be self-evident, etc., etc. So depending on what you want to do with the Declaration, if you want to focus on the issue of founders' rights, the principles and the values and the ideals of the founders, you can find some of it in the Declaration. But I would suggest that in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was passed in June, of course the Declaration passed in July, on June 12, 1776, it passes the Virginia Constitutional Convention. Here are a list of the rights. Now, it's pretty obvious that as Jefferson is drafting the Declaration, he's drafting it with these rights in mind. So my reading has always been that there's much more detail in the Virginia resolutions than there is in the Declaration. So if you're looking for specifics, the Virginia Declaration of Rights is probably more valuable in terms of specific information on specific rights. Because a lot of what you're seeing in the Declaration, you're kind of reading between the lines and reading in there. We hold these truths to be, and basically what Jefferson is doing is coming from an awareness of this. So this is probably a little bit more substantive. This next document coming around is off the internet. It's based on a book called The 5,000-Year Leap by W. Cleon Skousen. Now, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Skousen, but the preface or the introduction to his book was written by Glenn Beck. And Glenn Beck says that this is the book that every American has to read. And in this, Skousen, who was a professor of history and law at Brigham Young University, that's significant, because Skousen is a Mormon. And reviews of his book that I've read suggest that his Mormonism comes through in the book a lot. I have not read the book. But in that book, Skousen goes through the details of what he calls the 28 principles of freedom that our founding fathers said must be understood and perpetuated by every people who desire peace, prosperity, and freedom. And in this, he lists, I've given you a document which lists the 28 principles that Skousen addresses in his book. Now, this is what, and Glenn Beck, again, writes the preface to Skousen's book. And he's done a lot of hyping it. If you go on the internet, if you look on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or any of those places, and you look up the 5,000-Year Leap, you're going to see a lot of references to Glenn Beck because he's been pushing this book a lot recently. The point I'm trying to make is that if you look at the principles, you're beginning to see that there's a lot more here than is in the Virginia Declaration of Rights or the Declaration of Independence. And this was the point that this is kind of a continuation where I was going before lunch. But this is an effort to try to basically suggest that the founders meant more than the founders said they meant. And so you can read these principles. If you look at number 6, all men are created equal. Skousen takes it upon himself to explain what that is. Jefferson says that all men are created equal. Skousen said all mankind were created equal. The founders knew that in these 3 ways, all mankind are theoretically equally treated as equal before God, equal before the law, equal in their rights. Equal rights, not equal things, etc., etc. And you can see that there's an awful lot of political and economic principle coming through in Skousen's stuff, and it's interspersed with what he attributes to the founders. This is, I just wanted this as an example of some of the things I was suggesting this morning. I have 2 more. There's an organization called the John Jay Institute for Faith and Society and the Law. That should be enough. And this is a core principle statement of the John Jay Institute for Faith, Society, and the Law. And you'll see that this is very similar in many ways to Skousen's stuff. So basically, the very first core principle of the Jay Center, of the Jay Institute, is that God governs in the affairs of man. So the basic operative premise here of the Jay Institute is that God directly intervenes in man's life, directly. Now, without getting into this is significant. So then they go through in detail. Human flourishing depends on the Creator's benevolence and living within His order for pursuing the good life. For national and civic well-being, all law and public policy should be in agreement with principles of natural law, universal ethical norms of right and wrong, and the assumption is that everybody knows these innately because they are natural law. They are embedded, or these are the inalienable or endowed rights and awareness that Jefferson talked about when he said people know right from wrong automatically. They have conscience and good sense and all these other things. So you can look at the Jay Institute and some of the core principles that are associated with that statement. This is an article that appeared in the Washington Post on June 20th. And basically, the author of this, Stephen Livingston, his basic premise, as you can tell from the title, is that the founders have become so hot politically today that everybody from the right and left is claiming them and is citing them and quoting them and all of this. This article is entitled in the Washington Post, "Flame-Throwing Political Books from the Right and the Left." And basically, this is just stuff that's out now. And Livingston says, judging by the political books hitting the summer shelves, we're gearing up for the next civil war, or maybe an uncivil war. The titles from both the left and the right are rude, self-righteous, and inflammatory. Let the summer literary flame-throwing begin. If you believe the conservatives, we have a president who's engaged in a war on the United States. We have the right wing deploying Taliban jihadist tactics to blast America back to the Stone Age, when manly men ruled, women were submissive, and religion silenced the voices of science. Amen. Yes.
Oh, you are so outnumbered.
Yes, it could be a long, hot summer, especially for you. But when does a SWAT from the left cancel out a snipe from the right? When do we reach a state of political imbecility where only the noise exists and all thought and reason have drained away? You judge. Here are the titles. How Obama's Election Drove the American Right Insane by John Amato and David Newert. the gist, and then he basically gives a summary of the book. Next one, Common Nonsense, Glenn Beck and the Triumph of Ignorance by Alexander Zaitchik. American Taliban, How War, Sex, Sin, and Power Bind Jihadists and the Radical Right by Marcos Moulitsas. Toxic Talk, How the Radical Right Has Poisoned America's Airwaves by Bill Press. Many of you have seen Bill Press. He's been on TV a lot. He used to be on one of these point-counterpoint programs. Republicans, They Came to Feed on the Bali Politics by Von Scholey and Stephen Tatum. The Blueprint, Obama's Plan to Subvert the Constitution and Build an Imperial Presidency, Ken Blackwell and Ken Glukowski. The Next American Civil War, The Populist Revolt Against the Liberal Elite by Lee Harris. The Post-American Presidency, The Obama Administration's War on America by Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer. To Save America, Stopping Obama's Secular Socialist Machine, Newt Gingrich. The Manchurian President, Barack Obama's Ties to Communists, Socialists, and Other Anti-American Extremists, Aaron Klein with Brenda Elliott. So that gives you an idea as to how hot this is. Now, I don't want to go into a thing here because Wendy's going to do something here in a moment, but what I want to basically point out is this gives you an idea as to the kinds of things that people are doing with the founding. And I don't care whether you're talking left, right, or whatever, this is what kids and their parents are exposed to. Many people get their history from talk radio and talk TV and this kind of stuff. And so as teachers, we need to know this. This is very, very significant. I have one more handout. This is a short one. Before he published his Age of Reason, Thomas Paine asked Benjamin Franklin to review the manuscript for the Age of Reason. This is Franklin's reply to Thomas Paine. I've read your manuscript with some attention. By the argument it contains against a particular providence, though you allow a general providence, you strike at the foundations of all religion. For without the belief of a providence that takes cognizance of, guards, and guides, and may favor particular persons, there is no motive to worship a deity, to fear his displeasure, or to pray for his protection. I will not enter into any discussion of your principles, though you seem to desire it. At present, I shall only give you my opinion, that the consequences of printing this piece will be a great deal of odium drawn upon yourself, mischief to you, and no benefit to others. He that spits into the wind spits in his own face. But were you to succeed, do you imagine any good would be done by it? Think how great a portion of mankind consists of weak and ignorant men and women, and of inexperienced, inconsiderate youth of both sexes, who have need of the motives of religion to restrain them from vice, to support their virtue. I would advise you, therefore, not to attempt unchaining the tiger, but to burn this piece before it is seen by any other person. If men are so wicked with religion, what would they be without it? I intend this letter itself as proof of my friendship. That's a pretty strong book review. What I am suggesting and trying to suggest with all of these is that you look at the Declaration, you look at the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which is a specific compendium, if you will, of the major rights that were generally considered priorities during that period. That thing passed on the 12th of June, less than a month before the Declaration of Independence passed. So that's, when Jefferson talks about self-evident truths, that's probably what he's talking about, is what's in the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And then you look at Salson and the Yale Institute, the John Jay Institute, and you look at one approach, at what one side is doing with the founders, and then you look at Franklin, who's on the totally opposite extreme, who's looking at religion in a totally different, basically what he's talking about is religion is very valuable to society. You can't afford to criticize it and chastise people for their religion, because look what's going to happen to society if you're successful and there's no religion. What's going to happen? So he's looking at religion totally as a vehicle to improve or to enhance governance. So you've got the whole range from evangelicalism on the one hand to rationalism on the other, to secularism on the other. And then you've got this article out of the Washington Post which lists the titles of some of the books that are out this summer. I mean, this was just June 20th, less than a month, 10 days ago, so 10, 12 days ago. So basically what I'm suggesting is you begin to get the range here, and you begin to see, it seems to me, I begin to get a sense of the magnitude of our challenge as history teachers. Because ultimately, not to necessarily attribute anything more to Franklin than he deserves. He doesn't need me. But it's pretty obvious that our kids are getting their understandings from somewhere. We better start doing something different than we've been doing. Because, and this is totally personal, totally off the top, but my sense is that I don't care how many West tests kids pass. Something's not happening out there. We may have a culture of young people that can pass tests, but I'm not sure that anything's penetrating. I think they've shut us out. And my feeling is we can't afford that, because if we're shut out, if what we're about is shut out, then that ultimately means that they may be receptive to the last person who speaks to them, whether it's Keith Olbermann or whether it's Glenn Beck. I mean, you look at those two extremes and you begin to get the feeling. One of the philosophical realities of our society, psychologists are doing studies all the time reinforcing this, that in a society where there's as much choice and as much media availability as there is today, as well as the internet, people tend to go with the voices they most agree with. I would suggest to you that that is not conducive to an education. By definition, an education requires some sort of confrontation with what we believe. If our whole life is spent going out there and finding only the things that agree with us and reinforce what we already believe, we may be in real trouble. Whatever it is, whichever side it is. So it seems to me that there's something else, and that's really what I hope this program will be about. So with that, now I got rid of all this paper, thank God. We have $5 million worth of technology here, and I'm still running paper off by the tree. But I got a call the other night from Wendy Hendricks, and I told her at that point I was in the midst of my panic, because I had just found out not too long before that Bob Bliss wouldn't be here, and I was trying to figure out how to do American history and do the founding without the colonial period. And that's a little bit difficult. We're still struggling with that one. But I think we may have a couple of ideas. But anyway, Wendy offered and in fact requested and offered to help out a bit. Wendy was in our previous program, as was Mary and Gail and several others that I'm sure you know, and Richard and several other folks. But Wendy wanted an opportunity to share some things with you. So I thought this was a good time to do it. And what we'll do this, and then depending on what time it is, we'll either take a break or we'll let Keith do his thing, and he can take us from there to dinner. But Wendy.
I'm actually in favor.
Ah,
So it's okay.
okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
Oh, I got a microphone. You'd be on the internet. You don't want to be on the internet? Then you don't have
No,
to be.
because I'm only walking around. I'll be
Okay, all right.
I have participated in this project. Gosh, how many years ago was that we did this? 5 years ago. And I thought to myself after the first couple of days, what am I going to do to take back to my elementary school kids that they'll be able to understand some of these concepts and some of the things that we've done here. And you know, I was sitting there and just thinking and thinking, and I looked at the documents and I thought, gosh, there's no way, you know, the Federalist Papers, things like that, my kids are not gonna be able to do that. But I came up with some ideas and things that I can use in the elementary school classroom. So you all are gonna pretend for a while that you're 4th graders. And I'm gonna do a lesson like I would with a 4th grader based on a document. So, is everybody, are we all 4th graders now? Okay, good. All right. Everybody needs a piece of paper. So go ahead and get a piece of paper and a pen or pencil. You know, we fold a lot of paper in my classroom to take notes, so that's what we're gonna do. Now I need you all to take your paper, and you need to make 30 sections with it. And I'll put it up here under the document. Let's see.
You're going to dim your lights a little bit.
This is more high-tech than what I have at school.
Let's see here. I bet it's under room lines.
Uh-oh. Okay, this works. All right, so you all should have 3 sections of paper. And go ahead and draw a line. Now make yourself a chart. Which is still not.
Yeah, I can see it line.
Here we go. There we go. All right, you all are gonna write a K, a W, and an L on your paper.
I want to see what O'Brien's looks like.
All right, I have no idea how to turn that around.
There you go. One more, one more. There you go.
That's what I'll do. Okay. So we're gonna talk about the Pilgrims. So everyone have their chart ready? Okay. So go ahead and we're gonna write Pilgrims at the top. And I'm sure the elementary school people can tell you what KWL stands for. Can you tell me what KWL stands for? Mary? What you wanna know and what you've learned. So, first I want to know, what do you all know about the Pilgrims? What do you know about things you all would like to know about them. Okay, what did they eat? What'd you say, Gail? Okay, why did they come? And we're gonna answer that here in a little bit. It's a gifted fourth grader, that's okay.
Do they have to go to school?
Why did they have to go to school?
Did they have snow days?
Best word, West Virginia.
All right,
Here's one. What did they do about their cell phones?
uh-oh,
Or their Xboxes?
their Xbox. I don't think the Pilgrims had Xbox. I'm gonna give you all a few minutes to get those down, because I know some of my students will be like, Miss Peters, please wait, please wait. And I'm gonna show you all something. If I can get back to the computer. Uh-oh. No PC signal.
One at a time.
Okay. While we're fixing that, I want to talk to you all about something called the Mayflower Compact. Someone said that the Pilgrims came over on a boat. And it was called the Mayflower. Does anyone know what a compact is?
It's that thing your mommy powders her nose with.
Well, it could be something that your mom powders your nose with, but someone over here said it was an agreement, or a car, an agreement between people. So we're going to look at an agreement that the Pilgrims came up with. It says this original document, which a document is like a book or something. And remember, we talked before about primary sources. Do you all think this might be a primary source? Okay. And if you'll look at the highlighted part there, would someone like to read that for me? Okay, I'll tell you what we'll do then. We'll read it together. On my count of three, we'll all read together. 1, 2, 3. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord, King James, by the grace of God of England, France and Ireland, King Defender of the faith, having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and the honor of our free country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. So, what is a colony? Does anyone know what a colony is?
A group of people.
A group of people, very good. And what I want you all to do is we're going to break up into groups, and you all are going to look at that first part where it stops in the northern parts of Virginia, and you all are going to look at the words and see if there are any words there that you don't understand, and then tell me what you think that this means. So I'm going to put you in groups. Okay, Debbie, Margaret, Pam, Kelly, you all are a group. The 4 behind you are a group, Mary in that group. You 4 are a group. Jennifer and these 3 ladies. Gail, if you'll come over here. And Johnny, you can be with them, and I'll put you with them. And Keith, these two people are your group members. And then you all. Yeah.
She's making it bigger.
Wait a second. Wait a second. I have it.
Oh, even better.
Because I was going to use it, so we'll go ahead. There you go.
She steal your thunder.
She stole a little bit. I'll work it out. Here, pass it around. Everybody take it. What about that really rotten fourth grader with the cell phone that left the room?
He gets detention. Detention.
I know I will just see this and answer me something, but terrible.
All the phone calls.
Oh, well, we're looking at that first part.
Oh,
That's what,
you're kidding me. Oh, I didn't know they was really wanted to. I didn't know anybody
no,
wanted
that's everybody's.
Yeah, they're
Oh, that's
What do you want to know about?
But that's what I'm saying.
okay. This is the microphone thing.
Well, you click that too. Up where you,
Oh, this part. And this, like, you wear this part.
and this thing you just wear on your belt or in your pocket or something.
Okay. Alright. I don't even have, I guess I can put it on my.
That's what it is, they're trying to hear you and everybody's calling and saying, we can't hear anything.
Doctor, that note that Professor Lily gave you, I need for you to take a look at it and let me know what you want Tara to do. She told me to get back with her and let her know. I don't know, he just gave it to you.
We're all just doing that first part.
Just the first part.
Do you want her to?
Yeah.
Okay, and what about words?
How many does class study? One girl measurements and I send a copy to a test. What is that?
Maybe so.
That's what all the calls were, Wendy.
Oh, okay. Okay, boys and girls, I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to finish up.
Hey, if there's any question, all these phone calls that went off was the fact that people can see her but can't hear. So there are people out there watching. She's got it on now.
Okay, are we finished? Okay, wonderful. I want you all to pick a reporter for your group, someone that's going to report out what you all found. And it has to be the person whose birthday is closest to July 4th.
Not me. That's you, I know it is.
We're going to pretend it's not.
Okay, we found that person? Okay, wonderful. So I asked you all to look for some words that you might not understand and then tell me what you thought that this meant. So I'm going to start with this group back here in the corner. If you all can tell me what you all came up with.
You just want to know the words that we came up
Yeah, any of the words that you had trouble with.
with? Well, we started by saying underwritten, and then defender, and
Underwritten.
honor, advancement, voyage, and solemnly mutual. I don't know how many you want.
Okay. There's a couple. Okay, this group, can you all tell me a couple words that you all had trouble with?
We had underwritten, read, we had that one. How far down were we supposed to go?
To Virginia.
Virginia? Colony?
Okay. Did any other groups have any other words you did not know? Okay. Why honor is spelled funny? Well, Pam, the reason honor is spelled funny is because this was written in Old English. It's the way people used to talk a long time ago. So, underwritten. Does anyone know what that word means, underwritten?
Maybe like hidden, subliminal.
Okay. It says, whose names are underwritten? Let me ask you all something. When you write a letter, what do you do at the very end? You sign your name. So it says, whose names are underwritten. So they have written their names underneath this compact or agreement. So that's what underwritten means. Now they said, dread sovereign Lord was another one that we didn't know. Anybody have any idea what you all think that might mean?
Does dread mean like dead?
No.
Does it mean bad? Means bad.
Does dread mean like you get an F on a paper?
You might dread what your daddy's going to do to you, Johnny, if you get an F on a paper. Dread's kind of like if you're kind of worried about something or you're kind of scared of someone. And sovereign Lord, sovereign means someone who's like a king. So do you all think that they might be talking about the king? Mm-hmm. And it says they're loyal subjects of the king. So a subject is what?
Servant.
Kind of like a servant, isn't it? And voyage was the other word. And a voyage is like a trip. And they took the trip on the boat. And it says to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. And a colony is just a big group of people, like someone said before.
But I thought that the Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts.
Well, they landed on Plymouth Rock, which is in, Plymouth is in Massachusetts. So, but what I've tried to show you all is kind of like what I would do with a document with kids. Like I said, it would be hard for fourth graders to read that entire document all at one time. But I think what we can do is we can ask kids questions, ask what they don't understand. And then, like I was going to tell you all, or ask you all too, what did you understand? Does anybody have anything they want to say about what they see here? What you think it means?
Being, you know, if I'm not mistaken, the initial intent was to settle in the northern parts of Virginia, but then the storm blew them north,
Mm-hmm.
and that's
Right.
when they landed where they did.
Right, they thought, didn't they think they were in Virginia? But this is just something I would kind of do with my kids to help them understand these better. Pictures are a good way. I know, I think in the lesson that I taught when Keith came to my class, we did pictures with the kids. And I had done immigration, so I had immigrant children, those Lewis Hines photos. But sometimes we just have to take things and break them apart for kids because it's hard for them to understand it otherwise.
Wendy, did you have any kids ever question the word amen?
No, and I think that's kind of a geographical thing. Like, you know, where my kids that I teach school at, most of them are Christian, and it wasn't really an issue. They never really asked me. But I think, too, you have to talk about religion when you're talking about that founding because they were going for religious freedom. And, you know, if I would continue with this lesson, that's what I would explain to them, that that was one of the reasons that they came. And I think, you know, you have to kind of explain that if you're going to explain the colonies.
We have an interactive timeline in our classroom, and we have it stretched all the way across. We would probably make a copy or make a little timeline marker for our timeline.
I've added another column to this,
Oh, okay.
and the last column is D. Once we finish going over this, then I make them look at what they thought they knew and what they've learned. And if there's anything that's different between what they thought they knew and what the actual event or information is, then they have to make note of what the differences have been.
That's a good idea. So, but, and I would end this lesson, I would have them fill out that L part, what they did learn. I'd probably do that together as a group, and then have them write individual paragraphs. You know, in 4th grade, they should be able to write 3 to 5 paragraphs, maybe explaining themselves and what they've done with their group and with the document. That's all I have, Keith.
Wendy, have you found, and I guess I could ask this to anybody in here, but I know you, so I can ask you. Have you found that you're doing more of this? Is there a tendency to require more of this rather than less?
There is, and even on the West test this year, I noticed that they have document-based questions for 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade on the West test. And I mean, it's going more towards that, to where they really need to have an understanding of what they're reading. And we need to teach the kids to where they can understand what they're reading, to where they can pick things apart like this and look at it and say, well, I don't know that word, how would I figure it out? You know, if we were in a classroom, I might have had dictionaries and let everyone look the words up. But I think that's important that we find out what background knowledge they have, what they need, and then they need to know that vocabulary. So I think in the elementary grades, that's the best way to do that. It's all you, Keith.
I was just gonna ask, could they paraphrase? Could you have?
Yeah, and I was even thinking, when I did this before, the kids wrote their own classroom compacts. So you could use this as a classroom management tool also. That they have, you know, that they're making a promise that they're going to do certain things in the classroom.
So that would be the Dread Sovereign.
Right, Dread Sovereign, Mrs. Peters. That's right.
Have you ever, I do this because I found it in one of my science textbooks that they used it in their workbooks, but I'll make, prior to me throwing another whatever in whatever subject, I always make comments and ask who agrees and who disagrees, and we kind of put them on the board and stuff, you know, and then as we're going over the information, we figure out why, if we agreed, why we were right, or if we disagreed, why we were wrong.
Right.
And you know, using the whiteboard and everything, it seems like it works pretty good like that, even for the, you know, because we're not, we have all different levels in our class, and it
Right.
seems like actually presenting it like you have or like that it works a lot better.
Are there any other questions? Okay, I'll turn it back over to you then, Bill.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Keith Lilley, but I've been getting emails since Saturday from Bob climbs out of bed, goes down and writes some stuff, and then he goes back to bed. And so basically, one of the things that I've been sharing my emails with Keith from Bob. And basically, what I asked him a magic question, and I found that he couldn't come. And I said, basically, what kinds of things were you planning to do? And is there something that we could do to make that happen? And not as good as you could, but we could try. So he started to send me 5- and 6-page emails about things that he was going to do. He sent 2 of them so far. And the first one was clearly an email. In that it was to me, and it wasn't, I mean, obviously he proved it. It had abbreviations and missing words and various other things. The second one was looked like something he had proofread, because we read a lot more smoothly than the first one. So anyway, I asked him on an email in response yesterday, I said, what if we copied your emails and gave everybody a copy? Because he's got websites in there and everything where you can find out things. And he sent me one today, which I just shared with Keith, and said, the only thing I would, he said, whatever you want to do is fine. The only thing I would ask you to do is make people aware that they are emails, I mean, the address. He didn't write a paper. So, there's misspellings and abbreviations and various other things. And the other thing he wanted me to promise to do would be to give everybody his email address, with the idea that if you had any questions or suggestions or comments or reactions or wanted more information or whatever, he promised he would answer. And he will do that. I know he will do that. So I think we're probably going to do that. If not tomorrow, then the next day. We'll kind of share his emails with you on the first one he's did with religion. He's very much interested in the fact that we are in West Virginia, which in the colonial period was Western Virginia. And Western Virginia was being settled and da-da-da-da-da. Okay. And what all of that meant in terms of families, in terms of fathers' control over their sons, in terms of opportunities to access land, in terms of economic growth, in terms of breakdowns in community. You don't have the kind of community you do in New England where whole congregations move or settle. But in Virginia, you have individual people who are on the make that are looking to speculate in land or expand into new lands and those kinds of things. So I think we'll probably do some of that. But I wanted to share that with you because a lot of the things that Wendy's talking about came from that experience with him before. And he did quite a bit, as I remember, with the Mayflower Compact the last time. Some of you know Keith Lilly. I think everybody remembers him from April at the Mining Academy. As I mentioned, Keith is teaching a class this summer in Beckley, and I think the class runs from 10 to 12:30.
11:40.
Okay, 11:40. So I got here a lot early. I was thinking he probably would get here at 3 o'clock, but anyway, he's here now. So I'm going to turn it over to him, and you can handle your time however you might want to, Keith.
Okay, but I have to be finished by 8, right?
We eat at 5:30.
All right. Okay. So we don't miss meals. Okay.
I don't miss many.
All right. It's good to see you. Before I kind of get started here, is this on or?
Well, we're about to find that out.
I thought I turned it on.
There's a little mute switch on there that's real easy.
I'll put it on mute.
Oh, okay.
Does it
No,
need?
you're on, you're on. Wait.
Where's it at?
Yeah, the little dot there kind of has to be facing you. So,
Okay, so it needs to be the other way, right?
well, we want it out where it's,
Maybe wearing a tie is a good idea.
or a lapel.
How's that?
Let me see.
All right.
Okay. Say something?
Something.
Yeah.
All right, good deal. I'm going to hand out some stuff. Bill's already done quite a bit of that. I just want to make one thing clear, that everything I hand out is more important than what he handed out. So if you have any doubt about what you should read what I hand out first, and then read what he hands out. I have some stuff I'm going to hand out for today. One was the Mayflower Compact, and I was going to do a whole group thing well, I still am. One was the Mayflower Compact, so I've already given you that. You have that. I also have here Bacon's Declaration in the Name of the People, July 1676. And so you can pass that around. We'll use that today. And I have selection from John Winthrop, City on the Hill. Okay, so we'll use that as well. And so we're going to use those today. And so you can kind of hold on to those at the moment. On Friday, I believe I'm slated to do a presentation on essentially woodland Indian culture. And basically, I'm going to focus on Indian culture and conflict in Western Virginia, okay? Which means I'll eventually probably get into Dunmore's War if I get a chance. And so I have some documents for that as well. And I'm just going to go ahead and give them to you so you have them for Friday. The first one's pretty short. That's Logan's Lament. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that, especially if you're familiar with the history of Dunmore's War. So I have that to hand out. Then I have a short packet basically of documents concerning the role of Indians in the American Revolution. And I have to give Susan some credit here, Susan Cheek some credit. She made this up for me, but I've drawn these documents from a book that's just recently published. And I have the cover of the book there in their own words, Native American Voices from the American Revolution. Basically what that is Indian speeches at conferences and things of that nature, dealing with how the British, in fact, were using woodland Indians in their effort to gain victory on the western frontier, okay? So you can take one of those. I'd appreciate that as well. And so you can have that. And so again, if you have any doubt about which one you should read that, right? And read that material and be ready on Friday for us to talk about the kind of information we're going to talk about in that particular type of thing. Any questions about any of this so far? All right, I know you've been hit with a ton of stuff, right? All kinds of material. All right, can you still say it? Oh.
No, that was, it was one right, everybody had to memorize it in the class. That was one of the big assignments.
Okay, well, you know, that's not bad. That's not bad. Not a bad thing to do, okay? We'll talk a little bit about Logan, talk a little bit about the woodland Indians and Indian culture, and especially conflict on the frontier on Friday, okay? I was especially disappointed to read Friday in an email from Bill about Bob Bliss not being able to attend. For a couple reasons. One, that meant I was going to have to do something, right? Somehow or another, I was going to do some more work. That was going to be part of the deal. Also, I realized that, you know, we spent a lot of time, and Bill spent a lot of time writing this agenda, and suddenly that was, of course, you know, torn to shreds, at least in the first part of it. But mainly I was disappointed because I realized that you missed out in an opportunity to hear and get to interact with someone who really is an expert in one particular area, and that would be colonial American history. I am like you. I am a specialist, right? I teach survey level courses. I teach some upper level courses, but I'm a specialist. I have to know a little bit about just about everything. But Bob Bliss is someone who really knows so much, especially about Puritan New England, that you had an opportunity really to get a lot of content from someone. And so, needless to say, you know, we're pinch hitting here. We're trying to find something to try to fill that slot and to try to fill that gap that we really cannot fill, right? It's not really possible for us to fill it in the same way that he basically could do so. And so what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about colonial America a little bit. I'm going to introduce a few ideas, okay? And then I'm going to use these documents. These documents I passed out, not the Indian ones, but the Bacon's Declaration and especially the Winthrop document, okay? Let's think a little bit about colonial America. When we say colonial, I mean, what does that really mean? Somebody said a colony is a group of people, but yeah, a colony is a group of people, but what does that really mean, a colony, colonial? Say it again, Richard. You're owned by someone else, right? Someone else controls it, or someone else gains the benefits from it, right? Nations engage in colonialism or imperialism, usually for two reasons. And I think that's true whether you see it in ancient Greece or whether you see it with the British at this particular point in the early modern era. They're looking for sources of raw materials, and they're looking for markets. They're looking for markets, right? So the motives are often economic. They're often economic. And so what we see is the United States, of course, developed out of English colonies. English colonies. Why did colonies form when they did? I think it's an interesting question. I mean, if you think about the colonial era generally, I mean, even if you take into account the Spanish overseas effort, the French overseas effort, the Dutch overseas effort, and the English overseas effort, why did it take place when it took place? I mean, why didn't you have it 500 years earlier? The Vikings were here 500 years earlier, right? Vinland. How many of you heard of the Vinland colony? A few of you, right? Vinland colony didn't last, right? It caved. It didn't persist. There's something different about the contact that was established by Columbus in 1492 as opposed to what happened with Leif Erikson about 1,000 years ago. There was something different going on in that early modern era than it was going on 500 years earlier. It's a different Europe that's involved here. And what goes on in Europe is important in terms of what happens here. I think sometimes I have this experience when I'm teaching American history and I start to talk about the Stuarts or in the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution and things that are going on in England, and some students look at me like, what are you doing? This is American history class, right? Well, American history didn't happen in a vacuum. What happened in England is important. The people who left for Jamestown in 1607 left a different England than the people who left in 1630 or the people who left in 1680. Right? It's a different time, it's a different era, a different context. So what's going on in Europe is important. And there's something different about those European states in that early modern era as opposed to previous to that. And the terminology I just used, modern, right? What does that really mean? What is modernity? I mean, are we thinking about secularism? Are we thinking about the growth of state government? We're thinking about all kinds of things, okay? But something different is happening to those European states that enables them to make that contact and to make that contact last. I mean, if you think about Spain, when Spain starts to establish that overseas effort, that Spanish state is able to wait a generation before it really pays off. Right? They don't get any profit to win. I'm talking to a bunch of history teachers here, right? Tell you, when do the Spanish get something out of their empire? What has to happen? Say it again. And you're not a history teacher, right? The one guy in the room is not a history teacher or has the potential to be a history teacher answers that question until there's some conquest taking place. And in particular, I'm thinking about the conquistadors, right? In 1519, of course, Cortez, the conquistadors conquer the Aztec Empire. With that, you get a sudden influx of silver and gold into Europe, which, by the way, might be good for the king. It might be good for certain entrepreneurs. Probably not so good for the bulk of the European population, right? Because you have a sudden influx of currency. I mean, what makes money valuable at this time is not the inscription of the king on the coin. It's the fact that the coin's gold or the coin's silver, right? And so if you get more money coming in, that means what? Value goes down. You get a price revolution, okay, essentially when that takes place. But it says something about the Spanish state that they can wait a generation before they get profit. Something's going on in Europe. And that kind of is the context, I think, for when you think about colonial America. I mean, what is the nature of these European states? And I think one thing we kind of have to think about before we kind of really get into this is the growth really of modern government, right? You're kind of having a shift from feudalism toward the nation state or national state government, okay? Feudalism is essentially the political system of medieval Europe. We all agree to that? You going to shake your head? Okay. All right. So feudalism is the political system of medieval Europe. Some historians would want to get really technical about it and talk about manorialism as being the economic system. But essentially we're talking about two sides of the same coin, right? But feudalism was essentially a fragmented system of government. Fragmented system of government designed to produce knights, right? To produce heavy cavalry for the use and defense, of course, obviously the kingdom. Okay? And in feudalism, I mean, how do you teach feudalism? You're all history teachers. What do? You don't? All right, you elementary people can sleep on that one. How the rest of you teach feudalism? Go ahead.
You put up on the board each level and tell who they're responsible to and why.
Right. So you use a chart or you use a kind of pyramid or something like that. I do similar things when I'm teaching feudalism. I like to do it this way too. I like to use the class, and I'll say, I'm the king. Right? It's my class. And they're giggling. Former students are giggling. I'm the king. It's my class. And when you want to be the king, you get your own classroom. Okay? But until then, I'm the king. And that means that I owe nothing to no one in this room. Right? Feudalism is a system of obligations. And I owe nothing to no one in this room. Nothing whatsoever. If I grant land, that's the theory of feudalism. There's a big difference, by the way, between the theory and the actual practice when you actually look at it in terms of medieval history. But if I grant land to Bill and to Margaret, we'll ignore gender differences. You did a great job being a fourth grader, so I imagine she can do a good job being a medieval knight or lord, okay? So what we'll do is we'll ignore gender differences, and I'll say, I'll grant land to you, and I'll grant land to you, and I'll grant land to everyone on the front row, right? You owe me something for that land, right? Homage, which is a nice little embarrassing ceremony in which you place your hands between my hands, and you tell me that I'm your lord, and that my enemies are your enemies, how pretty my eyes are, and all that kind of stuff, right? But the main thing you owe me is military service. And you perform the military service as heavy cavalry, as knights. As knights. I am his lord. But if he has enough land from what I've granted, he can grant land to you. And you can grant land to her. All right? Lord? No. I'm his lord. He's your lord. All right? You see how that works? I have no power beyond the first row. If I am formidable enough, I put enough pressure on him that he puts pressure on you that I can mobilize the kingdom in that fashion. But in reality, right? Feudal monarchs were limited in their power. Feudalism was a fragmented, localistic system of government. Something was happening in Europe in the 1400s and the 1500s. It really started a little bit earlier, in which you're developing a different type of monarchy. You're developing a more centralized type of government. And part of that has to do with military change. You have changes in terms of how you're actually conducting warfare. The knight is so formidable on the medieval battlefield because infantry cannot withstand the charge of knights, right? But as a general, what I generally would do is try to attack the flank and the rear. But infantry is becoming more and more sophisticated by this particular point, able to use formations like a square formation. The problem with the square formation is there's no flank, there's no rear, right? That makes it difficult for the knight to be effective. Other things are undermining the knight. I mean, these are things you know, right? Like not just formations, but what else? Okay, the longbow. Longbow's been around for a while. Longbow is a great missile weapon, right? So is the crossbow. They're great missile weapons, right? The longbow is really effective, but you use the longbow in conjunction with a bunch of others, right? The point of the longbow is not like the Robin Hood movies, especially not like that recent Robin Hood movie, which I won't get into, okay? But it's not the point of hitting the target or knocking the apple off the head or something of that nature. The point of the longbow is having a bunch of people use it at one time. The problem with the longbow is that it requires a lot of training in order to get people to use that effectively in conjunction with others. The crossbow is a very effective missile weapon, but it's a fairly complicated mechanism for its time. And as the king, I can't go down to E.R. Armor Mart and order up 5,000 crossbows, and put them in the hands of infantrymen. And so essentially, the crossbow is a great weapon, but it's complicated, it's expensive. I have to have a craftsman, right, to manufacture each and every one. And so guns, primitive guns, are a better answer than the longbow or the crossbow to my new emerging infantry. Now, of course, I could take the pike and I can alter the head. You have the halberd. You know what a halberd is? Where you have the axe and you have, of course, the spear, but you also have a hook on one end. Well, you think about that in conjunction with a square. An infantryman can take that hook and can drag a knight off the horse. armor was heavier and heavier as time went on. As you go to chainmail to plate. And so knights, if you get them off the horse, it's kind of like when I was a kid in the country, you know, we'd take a turtle and put a turtle on its back, and how helpless the turtle was. That's kind of what's taking place. So that is a weapon that's important, but guns especially, right? The development of guns is incredibly important because it's easier to train people to use them, and they're going to be cheaper to manufacture. Now, many of these early guns are going to be almost as dangerous to fire as to be fired at with them, right? There's no doubt about that. In fact, sometimes I'll use a PowerPoint and I'll have a picture of a 14th century French culver or hand bombard. And I'll ask students, what is it? And students will tell you, it's a club. They come up with all kinds of different answers other than a gun, because it doesn't look like a gun to them, because it's, you know, you set it on this thing, you have the pan, you put the match in there, and, you know, it's all these, it doesn't look anything like what they think of as a gun. But the development of firearms means essentially that the knight is more and more obsolete. So that relationship that is feudalism is changing. The king is requiring something else. I can require money, taxes. I can require service in other ways. What happens is these kings are developing independent sources of military power, right? They're developing armies, right? Armies that have nothing to do with feudalism. They're centralizing their authority over their nobilities, because only the king has a type of resources, the tax resources, etc., that he can equip troops with, you know, weapons like this, especially cannon, right? Development of cannon. Traditionally, if you're going to resist your overlord, what you would do is you would draw to the castle. You ever play chess? You play chess and you take the king and you castle the king on the king or queen side at some point during the game in order to protect the king. You know, you were drawing into the castle. Traditionally, if you were going to resist the authority of your lord, you would draw into the castle. Richard the Lionheart died in 1199, besieging a rebellious vassal, right? Who was in the castle. So the cannon makes the castle obsolete. And so the authority of the king is increasing in the 1400s and the 1500s. And so we're moving from a feudal monarchy to a more centralized authority that can have more and more impact on everyday life, right? And note that that connection, that experience, the idea of a king being more powerful, is fundamentally connected with the idea of the growth of an independent source of military power, right? You have to have coercive force. And the king is also fostering economic change. I mean, a natural ally for the king and the growth, therefore, of these types of new modern systems of government, a natural ally for the king is the merchants, who are somewhat outside of the feudal system anyway to some degree. And so what the king does is he adopts policies that are designed to foster commerce in the kingdom. The king can do all kinds of things. The king can build bridges, right? The king can construct roads. The king can grant monopolies. What's in a monopoly? Right, only you can control it. That comes up in one of our documents here, right? Only you can control it. I can say that you have a monopoly on wine in my kingdom, Adam, right? Right. Adam has a monopoly on wine in my kingdom, which means Adam's going to get rich, because you don't drink water in early modern cities. You don't drink water in early modern London, not if you want to live. Right? Where are all the privies? Where's everything going? I mean, where's all the filth going? It's going to the river. And so you drink wine. And so that means Adam's going to be rich. Am I doing that just because I like Adam? If I'm the king? Yeah? I'm going to get my piece of it, right? You know, you're probably going to give me something for me even to do that. But if I do that, obviously I'm going to tax you, right? And so this is mercantilism, in which the king essentially is trying to orchestrate the economy, trying to basically control the economy, but also in such a way that increases his own revenue, right? That shouldn't seem all that surprising. Governments are always interested in revenue. Always have been, always will be, okay? So you see the growth of a different type of government involved here. There are a lot of economic changes taking place in this era in which we see these European powers reaching out and forming colonies. I mean, part of the whole motive for forming colonies is economic, right? You want sources of raw materials, you want markets. What kind of raw materials were they looking for? I mean, what do the Europeans want? I mean, what was Columbus looking for? All right, I got all kinds of things. All right, you said what spices? What'd you say over here somewhere? Gold and silver. In fact, there's a great letter, you can use it, from Columbus to the King and Queen of Spain, in which he's basically promising them. In fact, I use it, sometimes I'll have students circle every time he uses the word gold, right, with a red pen. And so what you do, you look, and the paper's covered with red circles, right, because he's telling the king and queen, what we're going to do is we're going to have gold, and here's all the process by which we're going to make sure that your majesties get their cut, right, and make sure that everything's done in an orderly fashion. So spices, gold, where are you going to get those spices? I mean, where does Columbus want to go? Yeah, he wants to go to Asia, right? That's his goal, right? Because there are things there that Europeans desire, right? There are trade goods there, especially luxury items that Europeans had wanted for some time. They had been acquiring them. Silk's another good example, right? They had been acquiring them. Even during the Crusades, we see an increase in the amount of those goods that are coming into Europe from Asia. But it doesn't take an expert in economics to figure out essentially what's going on here. I mean, if you are a Portuguese merchant, if I'm a Portuguese merchant and I'm selling you folks silk, or I'm selling you tea, or I'm selling you spices, these are things you want, right? Spices are important because of the limited nature of the pleasure of the table at the time. I mean, you eat mainly the same thing all the time. Also, the meat that most medieval Europeans would eat would be rancid by our standards, right? And so pepper, cloves, these things are very valuable. But if I sell those things to you, I obtained them. I bought them from an Italian merchant who bought them from a Turkish merchant who bought them from an Arab merchant who bought them from a Persian merchant who bought them from an Afghan merchant who bought them from somewhere in India, right? Every man in that line, every middleman wants a part of the profit, right? They're not in it for their health. And so European nations are starting to think, especially in the 1400s, what happens if we find a direct route? Right? That's what the Portuguese are trying to do. They want to find a direct route. That's what Henry the Navigator is doing. He's looking for a direct route. So you set up a research and development center in Portugal designed to try to find that direct route. You work your way around Africa. You take note of all kinds of geographic formations, right? You try to make better maps in order to find that direct route, because if you do that, you cut out all those middlemen. A dream that does not die, I might point out, right? In 1671, September 1671, Bats and Follum show up at the New River, not far from my hometown of Parisburg, Virginia, right? At least the state of Virginia has a sign there saying that's where they showed up, right? And if the state of Virginia did, it has to be right? I guess, well, maybe not. All right. But they show up there. What are they looking for? If you read their journal, they're looking for the South Sea. They're looking for the Pacific Ocean. They're looking for the Northwest Passage. All right? They're looking for an all-water route to Asia because those goods are still wanted. Those goods are still valuable. So there's all kinds of economic things that are pushing Europe toward exploration, toward settling and establishing these colonies. They have states that are more conducive for these kinds of long-term efforts going on at this particular time. So there's all kinds of changes that are taking place. But what causes average Europeans to want to come to America? Land, right? The availability of land is a big one. Because land in Europe is, of course, wrapped up in the aristocracy and the church, right? The church and the aristocracy controls the land. And so essentially America will offer for Englishmen, for example, the dream and the hope, a possibility of owning your own land. And you have a means also of getting there. And indentured servitude would do that. Indentured servitude would provide a means for people to make it to America. Right? You're going to go to Virginia. You work for somebody for 7 years. After that, you may be able to acquire your own land. That which is impossible back in England is possible in America. It's possible in Virginia. So that's something I'm driving people at this particular time. What else? Say it again. Persecution or discontent, right? Or people who are upset. Persecution along what lines? Say it again. Religious persecution, right? You have an opportunity to go and avoid the King's Church, right? The Puritans are concerned about the King's Church. When Wendy's up here saying, what do you know about this, about the Pilgrims? I almost say, well, they're in opposition to the Church of England. All right? Say it again. One more time, I'm sorry. Criminals. Yeah, that can be a part of it too. In fact, from the English point of view, the perception in England is overpopulated. Whether that's actually true or not, that perception is certainly there. And something that the state consciously will do, that England will consciously do, especially in the early 18th century, is a policy of transportation, or the Transportation Act. And essentially they will send criminals to America. And you get to pay your own passage too, right, through indentured servitude. I mean, because there are some criminals, what are you going to do with them? I mean, not everyone is committing a capital crime. I mean, murderers, people who, of course, you know, are guilty of treason, you know exactly what to do to those people, right? It's going to be execution. But what do you do with prostitutes and pickpockets and people of that nature? One option is to send them to America. One option, say it again, or to Australia, right? One option is to send them out. And so I tell you, a good book about that, especially in terms of colonial America, is Bound for America by A. Roger E. Kirch. Okay, A. Roger E. Kirch. And that was published by Oxford University Press, probably in the early 90s. And he looks at that extensively, especially the Transportation Acts and that particular element of it. But discontent, persecution, as you want to avoid the persecution of the king, and if you're opposed to the king's church, the church reinforces the authority of the king. The separatists, you know, want to essentially, the separatists believe that the Church of England has no hope, that it essentially is completely corrupt, and that it's too much like Catholicism. They reject it completely and they want to get away from it, right? The problem is you say that in England, the Church of England reinforces the authority of the king. I mean, James I says, no bishop, no king. And so you will, of course, experience persecution from the state. And so America does offer like an escape for that, okay? Certainly so. You can also have political discontent. There are people who will leave England in the 17th century because they're upset with what the king is doing, with how the king is trying to increase his power, his authority. And the Stuarts are doing that, right? They want to rule without parliament. Charles I will try to rule without parliament throughout the 1630s. Right? And so there's political discontent, the religious discontent. Anything else? What'd you say? Yeah, avoid debts, right? Or you know, that's going to be a part of it. A judge can send you to the New World, right? By the way, there's another thing a judge can do to you. He can put you in the British Army, right? So British soldiers are very often people who, I mean, I'm talking about the rank and file. They're very often people who are escaping from debt. They've been sent there by a judge. They don't like their wife anymore and they're trying to get away from her. You know, all kinds of things like that. What did you say? Adventure. I think so. I think so. And I think something that kind of really spurred this on, and I think is important in terms of when the English colonies really started to develop, was of course the War of the Spanish Armada, which has certainly kind of stirred the English imagination. But more than that, it also meant that England was going to be the power that would have naval supremacy after the 1580s. And naval supremacy is going to mean a lot in terms of the English effort. I mean, if you look at England and their overseas ventures, I mean, they make their first voyages when? They have several significant ones in the late 1500s, but they actually start in the 1490s with the Cabots. They actually start during the reign of Henry VII. And these do not materialize into anything significant. And I think part of that is you really do not have naval supremacy yet. I mean, you're still playing at a disadvantage, especially as opposed to Spain at that particular juncture. But by the late 1500s, by the late 16th century, things are changing, right? Because of the War of the Spanish Armada and British victory, that meant that essentially, Britain's going to have supremacy of the seas. And that means everything in terms of trying to have overseas colonies. Oh yeah, wood's a very valuable thing. That's one thing about the Jamestown folks. One of the first things they do is they start to cut down trees, send back trees, send back wood, send back timber to England, right? So timber is a very valued commodity, to say the least, right? I mean, you don't have a lot of that in England at the time. So, and that's something I try to get students to kind of think about. was talking about Batson Falls a while ago in 1671. When they see the mountains in the west, they had that whole phrase, pleasing yet dreadful, our dread sovereign Lord. There's something awesome about that. There's something intimidating about those trees, about those mountains. And you have to remember that when they saw those mountains and they saw around the New River and everything, what they saw was virgin timber. It wasn't anything like what we see. Right? They saw huge trees that had been there for centuries on end. And so what they were beholding was really something majestic, to say the least. But it also was a commodity, right? And it was something that certainly was in great demand back home. So I don't think it's an accident that European powers were expanding and forming colonies at the time that they did. All kinds of factors are involved in terms of their efforts at this particular point. I don't think it's an accident that the English really didn't get things going till after the Spanish Armada, until after they have naval supremacy. I mean, they had a few efforts in the 1580s. You think about the voyages of Sir Humphrey Gilbert. You certainly think about, of course, the Roanoke colony, the Lost Colony. That is right during the War of the Spanish Armada. But once they have naval supremacy, obviously England's going to be able to, it's going to logistically be able to be involved in this type of activity. Let me tell you a story here before we kind of get into this a little more in depth. In 1665, a group of royal commissioners came to Rhode Island, and their main goal was to try to arbitrate between a boundary dispute between several colonies. Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, all were involved in a boundary dispute. It wasn't clear where the boundaries are at. In fact, that's something you see consistently here. Even in the 18th century, even as late as after the 7 Years' War and in the beginning of the American Revolutionary War, it's not clear, who should possess Pittsburgh. Should it be Pennsylvania or should it be Virginia? Right? There's boundary disputes. And every party involved in that boundary dispute had a document from the king, right? With the seal of the king. They had some kind of official recognition of their boundary. Even if the boundary has a detailed, though highly unintelligible description, they have some kind of legal basis for their claim to land. These commissioners recommended, obviously, some kind of compromise, and then sailed back to England, and of course the dispute flared back up again. There's something kind of stop and go. There's something kind of that lacks unity in terms of the English imperial effort. And part of that has to do with a lack of knowledge of geography. I mean, the king and the king's administration is off in England, in London, and they make grants of land without really knowing much about, the geography of the land. How many of you teach West Virginia history? 3 or 4 of you, right? I mean, you're familiar, I'm sure, with the Fairfax grant, right? Lord Fairfax was granted by King Charles II over 5 million acres. And that later would conflict with grants that were made by the colony of Virginia. And there would have to be a settlement between Lord Fairfax and the colony of Virginia in order to determine, who owns what, which had an impact in terms of settlers too, because if you bought from the wrong party, then you can end up losing your land. Or you can end up buying again from someone and even paying for your own improvements. I mean, there are a lot of implications in terms of that. And that kind of, what that kind of shows is that, the Crown operated without a lot of geographic knowledge and granted overlapping grants, right? They're not always clear what's going on. So, I mean, really, in a sense, it's kind of a crazy quilt pattern in terms of land control in North America. But there's something also there's kind of a disunity in terms of how England goes about things because the colonies are so different. I mean, there's a big difference between Virginia and the Carolinas and Puritan New England. They're founded for different reasons. They develop very different economies. You're going to love this, Bill. You really start to teach Civil War actually in the colonial era, right? Civil War, the most important topic in American history. All the stuff we're doing this week and next week is just kind of, preparatory toward the real important stuff, the Civil War that we'll deal with next year, hopefully. The Civil War, right? You kind of start teaching the Civil War in the colonial era, I mean, Virginia and the Carolinas develop a staple crop type of culture with a plantation economy and a planter class, an aristocracy whose power to a large degree is based on their ownership of land and slaves. Now, slavery existed in the northern colonies, but the North doesn't develop that type of economy. In some ways, the South never stops being colonial. Well into even the 19th century. They maintain that kind of colonial economy. They're still producing a raw material, right? Be it tobacco, be it rice, be it later cotton. They're still producing a raw material. That's what happens there. But in New England, you have that tendency toward shipbuilding and fishing and all those other types of industry. Such a different economy develops. Well, how did you get such different colonies? Well, they were founded at different times for different reasons. And they're different societies in so many ways. And I think something that Bill was saying about Virginia I think is important. If we think about, for example, Jamestown. I kind of dim the lights here a little bit so we can get the PowerPoint. If I can find the room lights. I'm going to take another one here. All right, that's good. Okay. So if we think about Jamestown, for example, when was Jamestown founded? 1607. Who did that? Okay, go ahead. You founded them? Oh. Okay. All right, go ahead. I thought you were going to answer that. The London branch, or the London Company, or the London branch of the Virginia Company did that. King James I came to the throne in 1603. He was keen to grant grants of land. He especially favored both branches of the Virginia Company, the Plymouth branch under Sir Ferdinand Gorge, and then also the London branch. The Plymouth branch tried to establish a colony in what we think of as Maine and failed because of the weather, obviously. I mean, they didn't make it through the first winter. The London branch would be successful. They would establish Jamestown. They would be successful, but it didn't seem that way at first. I mean, it was really rough going at first. But I think it does say something. Kind of back up here just for a moment. I was talking about economic changes. It says something that Jamestown was founded by a company, a joint stock company. One of the, I think, biggest developments coming into that early modern era was the joint stock company, essentially the ancestor of the modern corporation. And that's something that I think Europe has that, you know, just that's not politically correct, but essentially you don't find it in the Islamic world, you don't find it in Asia at this particular time, this type of economic organization. The joint stock company, or the corporate form, you know, has such great advantages. I mean, essentially when you look at businesses, businesses come in what, 3 types of form basically. You have a proprietorship in which I own the whole venture, a partnership in which you and I own the venture, or you have the corporate form of the joint stock company in which we basically sell shares in the venture. And especially if you're thinking about overseas exploration, this is a tremendous innovation, okay? Because, you know, if I'm in Europe and I'm going to finance a voyage, you know, to Asia, we want to get silk, we want to get spices, and we want to get all those types of things. If I'm going to finance that voyage, and I go and I hire a captain, I hire a crew, I hire a ship, they leave Europe, they go off, they make it to their destination, they come back, I will make tremendous profit. I mean, there are examples, even in Puritan New England, of ventures making 600% profit as late as the 18th century. 600% profit. Tremendous potential for profit, but there's also a tremendous potential for risk, right? If I own the whole thing, and that ship doesn't make it back, I've lost the whole thing, right? I've lost it all. I mean, all kinds of things can happen to that ship by the time it leaves Europe, gets to Asia, and comes back. I mean, I might hire a captain who ends up being oppressive, and the crew rebels on him and has a mutiny and decide they're going to spend the rest of their life on an island somewhere. Or he may get lost, or they may get attacked by pirates or by the navy of a foreign power. Or they may end up in a storm and end up at the bottom of the ocean. All kinds of things can happen to that ship from the time it leaves and the time it comes back. But if I sell stock or shares in the venture to other people, look at how much capital I mobilize. Right? You mobilize so much more capital by spreading the risk. And I think that is one thing that will give European nations such a tremendous advantage in that early modern era, that they have that type of economic organization. And you kind of see their value and importance here, right? The company, it is a private corporation that founds this colony, right? Is the king involved? What do you think? Is the king involved? Well, you look at me like, yeah, of course. Can you do business in the state of West Virginia without the approval of the government of West Virginia? Not legally. Try it. See what happens, right? So you have to have the king. You have to have the charter and the king, you know, Jacobus Rex of our mere grace in motion, all that stuff in which he tells you why, you know, why he can bestow these honors upon you. You certainly have to have the approval of the king. You certainly have to have the king's signature. You have to have the king's seal on the charter, so to speak, right? You have to have that. You have to have approval in order to be able to do this. And that shouldn't seem like all that unusual to us. I mean, to some degree, the growth of modern capitalism and the growth of modern government come together. They go together, right? I mean, they're not separate. They basically come up together in the early modern era because kings want businesses to be successful because they're going to get revenue from it. And they're going to use that revenue to do what? Enhance their power, right? More mercenaries, more guns, more cannon, all that stuff, okay? And so, see, I hate that when it happens. Uh-oh. I won't worry about it. Won't worry about it right now. All right. So essentially what we see here in Jamestown is a private company with, of course, a charter from the king founding this successful colony, which is not successful at first, right? They basically had three goals. One, they were to find the Northwest Passage, a goal they will not accomplish. Why? It doesn't exist, right? You can't find something that doesn't exist. It'd be like me trying to get you to find, you know, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Good luck, right? So they're not going to be able to accomplish that. Second, they're supposed to find sources of silver and gold that are comparable to what, you know, the Spanish had acquired when they conquered the Aztecs or when they conquered the Incas. They're not going to find that either. Third, they're supposed to acquire lands that are good for the, you know, for crops such as citrus fruits, right? Virginia is not really the ideal place to grow oranges. Okay, so they're going to fail in that too. It's going to be very tough early on. In fact, one thing I think you find in Jamestown, and you find it, in fact, you find it almost everywhere, is that there's no way these people would have survived had they not had Indian aid at first. They had to have Indian aid. In fact, Thomas Studley, one of the Jamestown settlers, had this to say about that. He said, he credited God. He said, God, the patron of all good endeavors, in that desperate extremity, so changed the hearts of the savages that they brought such plenty of their fruits and provisions that no man wanted. Right? So without them, there's no way we would have survived. But God did that. They didn't do that. They're savages. God changed their hearts to allow that to happen. Right? And so without, and I think you find it in Plymouth too. They're not going to survive without Indian help. Right? Initially, and I think it's kind of an interesting part of the story, where initially these peoples are welcomed by the native populations, and then later, only later, do the native populations realize the implications of what their arrival really means. Okay? But at first, this is not a successful colony. They tried to run things communally, and of course Captain Smith says that, you know, happy was the one who could shirk his task and could slumber, you know. In other words, the industrious, you know, the lazy lived off of the industrious because you did things in a communal fashion. Institution of private property, Smith asserted, meant that 4 people could do as much as 30 were doing before. But they're not successful until what? And what makes Jamestown really successful? Tobacco, right? Which they first cultivated successfully in 1612. By 1618, they're basically sending 30,000 pounds a year. About 10 years from that point, they're sending nearly 500,000 pounds a year, right? And tobacco is, of course, something that they acquire in that exchange with native peoples, right? With Indians. It's something that's a part of Indian culture. They use it for hospitality, for friendship, for diplomatic meetings and things of that nature. You smoke the pipe together.
There's something about, was it John Rolfe had some
Yeah.
illegal seeds that he had brought or
Right.
from somewhere else?
Yeah, and he's the one who first cultivates it successfully there in 1612, right? He's the guy who does that. And that takes off, right? That's your staple crop. That's your staple crop. Just as sugar would be in the Caribbean, that's how that would be in Virginia, right? But it's not successful really until after you really get that going. Some other things I think you might want to think about is in 1619, right? You had the development of the headright system, in which anyone who is in the colony of Virginia, of course, can get 50 additional acres for every indentured servant they bring over, right? That means that certain families end up acquiring large tracts of land. What you see is the beginnings of the development of that planter class, right? The Fitzhughs, the Lees, the Carters, etc. They come out of the 17th century. And at the same time, 1619, as you have the headright system, you're also seeing the introduction of African slavery into Virginia as well, which eventually, especially by the end of the 17th century, is going to be the major source of cheap labor, right? You're going to have a shift then from indentured servants toward African slaves, okay? And we might think about why that is here, here shortly. Also, I think something you can't forget about colonial Virginia, very important here, is the development of the House of Burgesses, right? Which also is around the same time. The first elected assembly in America, the longest running, still sitting, legislature in the world, as they often tell you, is of course the legislature of Virginia. So that's that you kind of can question that. What about British Parliament, right? But that's often what you hear if you're in Virginia, right? The kind of the idea of this, how great the Virginia legislature is. But you have the establishment essentially of a system of essentially home rule. And that's something you find in all the colonies. Right? Massachusetts will have the General Court. Virginia has, of course, the House of Burgesses. And that kind of represents the logistical problem I would kind of point out that London has trying to govern colonies. Right? I mean, you're 3 or 4 months away. So how do you administer a colony? How do you govern a colony? And so essentially the answer to that is you set up essentially a system of government there, right? Now after 1624, of course, the charter for the company is revoked by the king. King James I does it in 1624. Virginia becomes a royal colony with a royal governor sent from the king, who in essence is like the king in Virginia, right? So you have the king, you have the king's governor sitting there in Virginia dealing with essentially a parliament. The House of Burgesses is like parliament in Virginia. This is kind of like a sense of benign neglect. The crown will adopt this type of approach to governing the colonies, basically allowing them to govern themselves. And a lot of it's just practical, because the idea that you're so far away and it's so hard to assert your authority. But that is something that's going to develop. I mean, 100 and some odd years later, when the crown wants to assert itself more, you've had over a century essentially of self-government. I mean, what's the big problem that leads to the American Revolution more than anything else is direct taxation, right, following the 7 Years' War. Britain fights the 7 Years' War against France, which is a global conflict. You have a theater in America, you have a theater in Europe, you have a theater in Asia, and Britain's in debt over that conflict, and they want the colonists to pay part of the cost of that debt. And so they try to institute direct taxation, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, etc., all that coming out of that. But you've had, it's seen as a novelty because colonists had always taxed themselves directly through their colonial legislature, and now Britain's changing policy. And so that establishes early in these colonies, and it's something that you have to think about in terms of the American Revolution. You have a long period, essentially, of a system of home rule, in which Britain is using those colonial legislatures to govern those colonies, okay? But Virginia is a society that is largely male, it is largely young. There are 5 men for every 1 woman in Virginia. Adam's going, I hate the competition. It's not good. Now, if I had said 5 women to 1 man, Adam would have, he would have liked that. But he didn't like that. I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. I like to change it and make it suit you, but Can't do it, okay? Sorry. Truth's truth. All right? But it's a very rough and tumble society in many ways. And it's a society that has a lot of conflict, obviously, with those natives as they expand outward, especially considering they're using tobacco, which depletes soil. They're constantly looking for land. And in fact, in the 1620s and 1630s and into the 1640s, there's extensive conflict between the colony and, of course, the Powhatan Indians. There is a tenuous peace signed in 1646, which lasts for 30 years. But in the 1670s, you have a new wave of settlers coming into Virginia, and these settlers want more and more land. And so you're going to have more conflict. And this eventually leads actually to the conflict within the colony itself, and that's Bacon's Rebellion. And one of our documents has to do with Bacon's Rebellion. Bill, should we take a little break here at this particular point? All right. To about 3:30 we take a break, and then I have a little exercise for us, okay? All right. Excuse me. So what should I do with this? Should I put it on mute or?
Just go ahead and turn it off for now.
That means